Hello, sixth graders. Thank you for taking time to watch this video. I'm going to review the second half of the chapter. The second half starts with the year at the post and went through each season of what they would do. And it starts with autumn, and usually what's happening in autumn is the craziness of the summer is starting to wind down. They're making their final preparations to sail, or I shouldn't say sail, getting their canoes to go back across the Great Lakes to Montreal, or going the other way from Montreal to trading posts around the Great Lakes. So in the autumn is when they're making their final long journeys before winter comes where you can't travel at all. So that's what autumn really is making sure you're ready for the winter season, whether it's going to Montreal to get back to Europe or going to the trading posts like Grand Portage and others to spend the winter there. So in autumn, making final preparations. I'll come back to that. So you know what? Let's do it now. This page talked about the different workers or the different people that were involved in the fur trade. You'd have the trader. They were the ones that were in charge of the trading post. They were the boss. Sometimes they'd have one trading post they're responsible, maybe two. It just depends on the company that they worked with. Each company did a little bit different. So they were the ones who usually could read or write, and they came from a family that had money. So they had a wealth in their background. Then you had a clerk. The clerk was like the second in command. They were there to help the trader. They could also read and write. They would help run the day-to-day operations of the trading post. They also came from a higher up social status, not from as wealthy of a family as a trader would have, but they came from a little bit of money too. With voyagers, we talked a lot about during this time. They were the ones that did the heavy lifting. They were the ones that would paddle the canoes across the Great Lakes, also in the smaller rivers and lakes in the States and up also in Canada. So they were the hard workers. Many had no idea how to read or write. A couple might have, but not many. And then you'd have the hunter. Usually those would be your Dakota or Ojibwe, in this case, Minnesota. Different tribes around the Great Lakes and up in Canada. So the hunters would just do that. They would hunt the animals, whether it was beaver pelts or other animals like deer or bear. They might trade the meat with the voyagers and others. And then you have the pelt preparers. It was their job to get the pelt ready. So you trap a beaver, you kill it, you need to skin it and get it all nice and clean and ready to trade at the trading post. You also had the Ojibwe and Dakotas were suppliers. So they supplied other things like I mentioned earlier, like maybe bison, or not maybe bison meat, but bear meat, deer meat, venison, things like that, and other supplies they might need to help the voyagers might need to survive the winter. You also had Native Americans that act as guides because they knew the woods the best, so they could help guide the voyagers, the traders, the clerks around to know how to get around places. And then also you had interpreters, people that could speak multiple languages and help people communicate with each other. And there were some other roles of the fur trade. You have American Indian women who are in the fur trade. So hopefully you read this blue box. Sometimes a lot of women help with taking care of the pelts, doing a lot of the cooking and things like that. Some would also marry a fur trader or marry a clerk to kind of help strengthen that relationship. So they had a large role in the fur trade also. Then we go to winter. Winter is the time of the year that we mentioned before. That's when a lot of the trapping for the beaver and other animals went because their coats were the thickest. They were most valuable at that time. And a lot of time during winter, that's what the Native Americans were doing. They then take these pelts and they bring them to the trading post to trade. So a lot of the trading during the fur trade took place in winter. During this time, the voyagers did not have a lot to do. So they had a lot of downtime, boring time, because there's nothing really to do in Minnesota in the winter during that time period because there wasn't cities or things like that. So it was a pretty boring time for the voyagers during the winter. Then you also read about the Métis. The Métis were kind of a mixed race between the Native Americans and the Europeans that were coming over here. So that is what their term was, Métis. Some worked in the fur trade, oftentimes as interpreters. And then you get to spring. Spring is when things are starting to melt. So those rivers, the Great Lakes, are starting to become the point where they could be traveled upon. So now the voyageurs that spent the winter in the trading post, they're going to load up their canoes with with those furs that were traded for, and they'll bring them to places like Grand Portage. And then over in Montreal, European goods, those trade goods, are starting to arrive, like the pots and pans, blankets. They're starting to arrive in Montreal. And then once the lakes and rivers have thawed out enough, they'll start going. So those goods will travel from Montreal to other trading posts, and those beaver pelts will now start making their way to Montreal. So all that is really starting to happen in the spring. You're starting to see a lot more goods moving around during that time period. And then you get to summer. Summer, again, was just a lot of time was spent moving those goods and furs back and forth, because it's a long journey to get from Montreal to Grand Portage. It took many, many days and weeks. But in summer, that's when they'd have the annual gathering, the rendezvous. So they'd have the celebration, dancing, wrestling, singing, all kinds of stuff. The voyageurs loved adult beverages, so they'd be drinking liquor at this. So just a lot of celebration of everybody involved in the fur trade coming together. Here in Minnesota, that took place in Grand Portage up in the northeastern corner. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this human capital and profit part, but hopefully you read it and just understand that we learned about human capital before, how you can increase it by taking care of your body, learning from an experienced person, getting an education, those types of things. So the voyageurs, the clerks, the traders, they also had to do that. And they were all in it to make profit, to make money. So there you can see a group of canoes. Remember, we call that a brigade. So these are those Montreal canoes, or Canute de Montreal, or Master Canoe, or Canute de Montre. And we mentioned a lot when they're paddling, they like to sing. So here is one of those songs.
Canoeing in the cool of the evening I ride, where I have braved every tempest of sea.
But the French were the voyageurs. So the voyageurs were French. So they're not going to sing in English. They will sing it in French.
Dans mon canot de course, assis à la fraîche du temps, où j'ai bravé toutes les tempêtes, les grandes douces.
So they would sing while they're canoeing, because help them keep rhythm and all paddling at the same time. Plus, you're spending a lot of hours on the water. It is really nice to have something to entertain you. So that's why they did a lot of singing while canoeing. And then eventually, this part about coming changes. Eventually, the fur trade would wind up, slow down, would come to an end in the near future, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So there's not a whole lot I want to talk about on this, but just knowing the fur trade had a huge impact on the Ojibwe and the Dakota here in Minnesota. Really changed the way they lived their lives, for both good and bad, in bad ways. One thing I also want to point out, hopefully you paid attention when we talked in other videos I posted about portaging or portaging. Portaging is also a noun and a verb. So a place where there's either no water, so they had to get from one river to another river, and they had to go over land, or there's dangerous water, whether it's many rapids, or it's too shallow for a canoe. So the voyageurs would have to portage or portage over land, and you do that. So you portage at a portage, you portage at a portage. You're portaging at a portage. So that's where you're carrying your goods over land. Hard work. So I talked about that in other videos. We're not going to spend a lot of time on here. So that's the review of the second half of the chapter. We'll have a test at some point here. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.